Hello, my name is Kristina and welcome to my conceptual portraiture photography talk. Over 10 years of my portraiture, fashion and fine art work, I've learned a lot of things how to approach a conceptual project, and these are the things that I would like to share with you in this talk. So first of all, when I think of a conceptual image, whether it's a portrait image, fashion, fine art, or even still life, first of all, I think about what is the feeling that I'm trying to convey? What is this main message that this image is supposed to carry? Second of all, I think, okay, what kind of aesthetic will help me come up with that feeling? And this is where some inspirations come from. Personally, I find inspirations in the work of painters of the past, from Vermeer and Jan van Eyck to Hammershøi and Antonio Donghi. But of course, it's up to you where you will find your inspiration. It can be cinema, it can be contemporary art, installations, and things like that. So it is important to put together some inspirations that will reflect that main core feeling that this image is supposed to translate. So now let's talk about how do you approach, as you already know your concept, what would be your next steps? So first of all, it's art direction. So what you need to do is collect your thoughts together. So for example, I write down some keywords of that description that would describe in the best way, that feeling that I'm trying to create, the mood and the message that I want the viewer to get out of this image. When I write down these words, I also write associations. What does associate with that feeling or with that message? So I end up with like pretty big list of words, and I start combining them together, drawing some parallels, and trying to figure out what is the least expected way to maybe look at this issue, for example, that I'm talking about in the portrait, or look at this feeling, what hasn't been shown before creatively. And so I outline maybe some of the words, and then I start pulling references, visual references of how those words can be replicated or translated visually. Here are some examples of my mood boards of the shoots I've done in the past. So you can see how each story, each mood board is different from the other. And especially if you work not just by yourself, but you work with a team, you should give these references to your team. So they also know what you're thinking, what's the overall aesthetic, and they will also give you their feedback of how they feel about it. And then you can see if the feeling through these images is translating correctly, if they're getting that message. So it's also always helpful to check it with someone else before you go and start shooting. And usually you work already on, if it's an assignment, you work with an editor or a creative director. But if it's a personal project, then you talk to just your creative team, like hair and makeup, styling, set design, prop maker, and all the other people involved. So yeah, so that's your second stage, creating those references, checking on the right mood, if it's been translated visually well, and preparing all the elements. It is very important to think of that stage of your color palette and your lighting. So all these key elements, they should work together, they should sound together like an orchestra. So if something doesn't play the same tune, it has to go out. So don't disregard your color palette. Every little thing that is going to be in the shot, what the person is wearing, their skin tone, their background, every little prop, what color those things are, textures shapes, and your lighting. How are you going to light it? Light creates character, and that brings us to our third chapter. So first of all, when you are thinking about your lighting, I would also start with references. And you put together those lighting references with the other ones that you've had from the past, the ones that translate the mood, translate the overall message of the story. And so you can, while you see everything on one page, you can really tell if that type of light, the references that you've pulled, if it carries the same message, if it creates the same character, whether it's softness or it's, drama, intensity, whether it's a lot of light or very low key light, how many light sources, how much light is on the background, how much light is on the subject's face, on the subject's hands, on the environment around them. So the way I approach it, I think carefully about all these things, and also the ratio between the light on the subject and the light on the environment, the background. So how much difference in light do I want? That also will relate to the story, to the character that I'm creating, to that main feeling that everything started with. And deciding whether the light should be more natural or more dramatic, more visible or less visible, it's also very, very important to the story. So here are some examples of the lighting that I've done in some of my shoots, and you will see that I actually really quite like approaching the lighting in a bit of a less conventional way. I like using DIY things for my lighting, either to create a reflection or to create shadows. I play with any elements that I can find in my studio or in the house, anything, and just experiment with them and see how that would change the mood of my light and how would that affect the character of the story. I also find quite interesting working with different temperature lights. So for example, I would mix a window light and a warmer light source. And so that difference between temperatures, the daylight temperature is slightly cooler light, and then a warmer light source like a tungsten light, they will have a pretty big difference in the color temperature. And so that would create an interesting dialogue between the warm elements in the shot and the cooler, the ones that are more in the shadow, where that warm light, the areas that warm light doesn't reach. And so therefore I give a story, maybe a little bit more drama, but also I will create more dimension to my image. So yeah, just I would really encourage you to experiment with shaping the light, with transforming the way it's hitting your subject, with the softness versus hardness, and with multiple light sources that might have also a different color temperature. The next step after you figure out your light sources, how you're going to light your subject, your story with the light and the color. Another thing to make sure that it's translated really well is to use the right photography equipment. So I wanted to share what I use for most of my shoots. I do on this camera, which is Fujifilm GFX medium format camera. It's been with me for 3.5 years. I really love it, really enjoy working with it. I like the resolution that it has, on the capabilities of the medium format camera, especially, for example, with this lens, which is a 1.7 aperture lens, and it really gives you that very dramatic difference in depth of field when it's very, very shallow, and you have that really interesting depth in your image, like the old school film medium format cameras. So this is an 80mm lens that I use sometimes with this. It's a good portrait lens. A lot of times I also shoot with my 45mm lens, which is around 35mm on the 35mm sensor. So it's a slightly wider angle. I really like creating dynamic movement on the body language of my subjects. So this 35mm angle allows me to expand the space. First of all, I like sort of more sense of space in my images, but also it allows me to add a bit of distortion on their body, which I quite like. Not every portrait works with that, but if you know how to use it, if you don't get into much dramatic poses, which I rarely do, then you can create a very interesting sort of, a bit more dramatic body language that expresses maybe a tension or some kind of character that emphasizes the character of your subject when some parts of their body go closer or farther away from the lens. So I like adding a bit of more of those dynamic elements with this lens. And one more lens that I have for this camera is 110mm. This is also a really good portrait lens, really big, even bigger than the 80mm one you can see. Beautiful bokeh as well as on this lens. So it's really good for studio portraits or outdoor portraits. Just a really good, nice lens that I like to use as well, and it doesn't give you any distortion on the space. In fact, it gets you a little bit closer to the subject. So really works for some type of stories. Yeah. And so in general, why I choose Fujifilm as a system is because it really captures really well the dynamic range and the color range of images. And so for me, as a creative, as a conceptual photographer, it's really important to be in control and to have the flexibility with the tones and with color as much as I can. And it was a really big change for me going from a DSLR system to this kind of system. And I really wanted to show exactly how I use my raw files and what I do to them to really explain the difference, because the stage of post-production to me is as important as the idea search, as the reference, as the color palette that I decide on, the lighting. All the pre-production steps are equally important as the post-production, is what I do to all those elements in post. So let me take you now to Capture One and show you a little bit of my process as well. So this is a shoot I did recently with a beautiful young woman, Jasmine, and she is a footballer. And when I met her, I noticed this two interesting sides to her personality. On the one hand, she's very delicate and very sweet. On the other hand, you can see that she's very, very strong, physically, both physically and mentally. And of course, she's a footballer, so she has to be tough. So in this portrait, I wanted to show the two sides of that. And I think it's very, very important actually for your conceptual work to maybe not go for the simplest of the feeling, right? The viewer would enjoy to see the complexity of that message, right? So you can create that a little bit more intriguing kind of feeling that you feel both. So that's why she is, on the one hand, is not wearing any clothes to show a bit of that vulnerability, and on the other hand is the gesture and the shadow coming from the gesture, kind of creating sort of like a necktie and making it look a bit more serious and strong and powerful, and maybe more significant even. So that's kind of what my idea was here with this portrait. It's very simple. There's not too many things going on. but it was important to get the light, the color, and the skin tone right to really reflect, first of all, her as her, her nature, what she really looks like, what she feels like inside, and also create a story that I wanted to tell. So yeah, so let's start with this image. So what I usually first, I go into the base characteristics here, and this what Fujifilm provides for all their cameras. This film presets, and I sometimes just look at them to kind of see, okay, which direction can I go with this image, whether make it more dramatic, more saturated, or less saturated. What feels right for that feeling that I'm trying to create? What feels right for this story of this person? And so sometimes I just choose the preset as I shoot, and I keep it. Sometimes I, still look through it and decide what I would really like to do. So in this case, I'm just going to keep it that way. And usually I don't do any changes on the background layer. So I usually create a first new layer, new filled layer, just for tonal adjustments or tonal range. So for that layer, I usually start with a curve, Luma curve. So you have the two options of RGB and Luma, but because I'm working here with tones, I start in the Luma mode. And what I usually do, I try and play whether I want to add contrast or reduce contrast. And I find a lot of times really flattering to reduce the contrast actually and go down on the highlights and maybe open up the shadows just a little bit. So it is in a way of making an image a bit more flat, but since I'm not going, too drastically, I'm not changing it too drastically, it just adds a bit of a softness to the skin. So I will show you before and after. So this is, you can see that it makes the skin look a bit softer, but I don't do it too much, so it's very, very subtle. And then if I need to adjust the dynamic range, I can open up the shadows a bit more, reduce the highlights. A lot of times to kind of bring that contrast back, I will actually go with the black slider to the left to add more blacks. If I start losing the contrast by doing this curve and opening the shadow. But so I really like to start with adjusting the contrast, the dynamic range of an image, to kind of give me an idea of how much drama do I want here. And also, with this tonal relationship, what do I want to do to the color? So to me, this goes first. Then, and a lot of times I change this more than in this particular image, but for this one, it's enough. And so the second step is another layer for color adjustments. I start with, first of all, checking my white balance. Maybe I want, especially when I'm playing with different temperature of the light, of different light sources, then I may want to see whether I like it a bit cooler, a little bit warmer. So just see how that changes, again, the character of an image when it's a little bit cooler, for example. So I adjust that a little bit. And then I go to color editor tab, first starting with the skin. With the skin tone is really a quite necessary step for me to do. Adjusting maybe the saturation of the skin. A lot of times I like to do it a bit less saturated. seeing if it's maybe a little bit too red, so I will reduce the redness of the skin, and I would play with uniformity. And the good thing is, the files that you get from this kind of medium format camera, there's so much information on color that you can push it really, really far. So for example, if I now want to change that blue that I have here, I select it, and if I move the hue slider, I can make it completely purple, completely like cyan, and adjust, the softness of the transition, or make it more precise of what color I want to actually be affected in this selection. But you can push it really, really far without seeing any noise, any color aberration. And I just love it, because I tend to experiment with my color. I will move the sliders and I will see how that changes the overall story, the overall look of an image. Let's see, with this layer, it's very dramatic. Obviously, I'm just showing it to you just so you can see the difference. But what I really like in this case, that this can be done, made less purple. Then, to me, it creates a better contrast with that orange tone of a skin. That little bit cooler, more towards cyan kind of blue. I think it provides a much nicer contrast with her skin color. So so that's the second step. Like, if there are more colors, I would select every single color, make a adjustment here on the color wheel, and and play around it to see what I want to do. So I'm very, very careful, and I try to be very precise with every little color element to see how they work together as that orchestra that I mentioned before. And so as the last step here, I'll do another fill layer and name it color grading. And just do a little bit of more of a creative adjustment to, again, emphasize that character, emphasize the feeling of the story. So if it's more of a contrasty and edgy and maybe sunny kind of light, maybe I'll add some warmth to the highlights or to the midtones. I'll add some coolness to the shadows. So that's also quite an important step, because your color grading will elevate the look of your image. So it's not going to look like it just came out of a camera. So it has some character and look to it. So what I like to do, maybe in this case, I would make the shadow a little bit blue, maybe to add a bit of warmth to the midtones, maybe not so much. I like to separate in terms of the color temperature. If I do warmer midtones, then I'll do cooler shadows, and the other way around. And then maybe just a bit of coolness to the highlights, but just a tiny little bit, again, for sort of that separation, that dimension, adding more dimension to an image. So that's basically it. And I quickly showed my adjustment, but I have worked on this image before, so let me actually show you how the final adjustment looked to me. So I added a bit of that coolness to the overall image, and I really quite liked it. And so if we can see before and after, the change is quite dramatic. And this is the one we just worked on. So we have a lot of things that we can do in post, and every time it's gonna be, the impact on the viewer is gonna be different. So this is a very, very important step, like I said, just as much as what you do in pre-production. Okay, so now that I've shared my process with you, I would like to finish this talk with giving you 5 tips how to stay creative and how to approach conceptual photography kind of shoots. So first of all is you need to connect with your life experiences. meaning your formative events, something meaningful that happened to you recently or in your childhood, the things that you really like, the things you really dislike, the things that make you afraid, or things that make you comfortable and you really love doing. Like all this experience, I think you need to get in touch with them to really realize who you are and stay true to yourself. Second step is to choose subjects that really mean something to you. If it is important to you, it will reflect in an image. You will be able to tell that story in a so much more compelling way than a story that you don't care about. And if somebody else tells you that this is important, but you don't really feel anything about that subject. So make sure that you choose your subject carefully. Third, build your visual vocabulary. The more things you see, the more things you look at, whether it's classical art, whether it's photography, whether it's film and television, anything visual, you make some mental notes. What you like, what reflects really your aesthetic, what really makes sense to you as a photographer. Okay, number 4, conscious looking. So when you look at other photographers' work, you need to not just, save it somewhere in your folder and thinking, oh, maybe that's the light I want to replicate, or that's, some interesting visual idea. You need to really stop and think, why am I so attracted to this image? What does it make me feel? Because there are a million other images that we see every day that also have a good light, an interesting idea, cool location, or a good looking person in it. But some of these images you just flip through, you scroll, and you don't notice them. They don't stay with you. But some of these images that stay with you, you need to really break it down. Why? So conscious thinking. And number 5, new ways of seeing. So you need to really teach yourself how to think in a different way. So combine the uncombinable, like that keyword list that I gave you. Put very unexpected associations with those feelings that you just have written down. Put familiar things in a new context to give them a new meaning. Create something that would challenge yourself and challenge the viewer. Well, that's it. Thank you so much for being with me, for watching this. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope you've learned something new and got inspired. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for watching my talk. I hope you learned something new. I hope you enjoyed my ideas that I shared, and learned something useful to you, and also got inspired in your work in creating your conceptual imagery, and gave you some thoughts, some new ways of looking at things. So hopefully this was not only helpful but also inspirational. So I'm here for you to answer any questions you might have, whether it's regarding approaching creating portraiture work or any other conceptual work, or whether it's regarding post-production or pre-production and art direction. So all the steps that I've mentioned in my talk, if you are interested in lighting, for example. So let's see the questions that have come up so far. We'll start with Nikki. What is your favorite idea photo you've had taken? Probably, if I think back to like the past couple of months or the last year, I think it was the portrait of myself where I shaved my head and my hair was coming down my shoulders. So that both showed the strength and the vulnerability. And I think it's very, very important to create those complex feelings. And so I really like that portrait. Does that apply to all sessions? There are numerous. numerous overlaps that force you to prioritize. That's probably not for me. Is there a light source you refuse to use? Probably the question from Kim Hawkins. Probably no. I would use any light source. I like experimenting actually with different light sources. It can be a completely non-conventional something like a house light bulb or a flashlight, or anything. I like combining lights, as I mentioned, and combining different color temperature lights. Question from Katie: do you prefer working on location or in studio? Also, your photographs are so amazing. Thank you so much, Katie. Yeah, I prefer I prefer both. I think it depends again on the concept, on the mood, on the feeling, and what fits right to that feeling that I first of all want to convey with my image. I like to have control over the light, but I can do that on location as well as in studio. So it really depends. It really depends. It's been more working in studio recently because of the lockdown, but I still really enjoy working on location. Question from Robert. Did you always shoot with digital or did you use film at all? I have shot with film and I still shoot with film. I have another film camera, medium format, that I really love. And sometimes I combine two of them during my shoots and then see which ones I like better, and preferably film, but also combining with digital, and that works really well. Question from Mike: do you use zoom lens or fixed lens? Mostly fixed lenses, because they're just of a greater quality. They give you really nice, smoother bokeh, that softer background blur, and they're also sharper. So definitely prefer fixed lenses. Another question from Mike: how much work is spent at the computer? If it's a personal project, I do spend a lot of time just trying to figure out the most interesting way to adjust my images, play with colors. This is just a really important step of the process for me, as I mentioned. So I do spend a couple of hours per image on like color correction and grading and things like that. Glynis, sorry, I came late to the presentation. What camera and software? So Fujifilm medium format, GFX camera, and Capture One. They work together really well, match made in heaven. It allows you to adjust your colors and your dynamic range really well. Question from Colin: what are your thoughts on using a mobile phone as a camera? Have you used your phone for portraiture? Yes, I have. I love using my phone as well. And I think it doesn't really matter what camera you have. It's more about the idea you have. It's the feeling, again, the connecting with yourself, being true to yourself, and understand the feeling that you're trying to create. If you're clear with what you're saying, then the viewer will also have a very strong emotional response to this image. So it doesn't really matter, what camera it is. It helps, of course, in many ways when you're doing post-production, how much color, how much dynamic range you have, and what you can do with it. But at the end of the day, the only thing that matters is your idea and your concept and your creative vision. Question from John: the photograph of the footballer is superb. About how long was that session to capture the shot? Well, that wasn't the only shot in that session. We had, I think, 7 or 8 different looks, or we tried different props or different things she was wearing or holding. So in total maybe it took 5 hours probably. I think when I work on something conceptual, especially if it's portraits, especially when it's such intimate portraits, I take my time to connect with my subjects. I think it's really, really important to talk to them, to understand who they are, you know, what triggers their emotions, to make them also trust me and to understand what I'm going for. And so, yeah, we spent some time to connect. I also take time to adjust my light, to see where it emphasizes the character in the best possible way. Um, yeah, adjust all the elements that I need, decide creatively first and then start shooting, so I don't rush into snapping away, and going for a million different shots. But I really try to slow down. That's what I do with portraits, with conceptual portraits. If I shoot fashion, for example, or beauty, the pace is a little bit different, because basically it's a teamwork. We all know what look we're going for, so we get the model ready. I talk to the model, show them some references, what kind of poses, what kind of mood, and then it comes to just basically directing the model and getting that right emotion out of her or him. And yeah, I move pretty fast from look to look, because this kind of shoots, commercial shoots, they are very fast paced, and there's a lot of things you need to do within the shooting day. So yeah, so it really depends. My approaches can be different. Okay, let's see if any other questions are here. Let me see. Ooh, that's a lot coming in. Okay, which one should I pick? Simon is saying, thank you. This was really fascinating. How important is a studio to do your work? What is the minimum size of a studio that would work? Ooh, good question. Maybe, I don't know, 5 by 5 meters would be a good enough space for the kind of portraits that I showed some examples of. Something that, with a slightly wider angle lens, you can still do a full body without distorting the space completely. So check a 35mm lens. What's a good size to do full body shots, and that should be your reference point. Is there any Fujifilm simulations? Question from Nelson. Did you see more than others? How you choose between them? Not really. Every time I check, usually I don't go for very dramatic contrast. But yeah, I check every time what presets can work for me. Questions from Nick. How many ideas make it to production? Do you abandon many along the way? Yeah, at the very first stage, I try to stick to one idea. And like I said, that core message, core feeling, what this image is about, what is so important for me to say in this image. And that's what I narrow it down. I kind of funnel it down from a wider range of emotions and messages to the main one. And I always come back when I make creative decisions. I always get back to that feeling and say, oh, does this reflect that? So yeah, who are your clients, individuals or organization? Question from Nick. And how do you get them? Oh, that's a really big question. But my clients are mainly organizations. So it's fashion. So for example, it can be magazines, it can be editorial portraits also for magazines. It can be also commercial brands, fashion brands. So yeah, all kinds of mainly organizations. I work with individuals just for personal work, as I do fine art photography. That was it. Thank you so much for watching. Again, thank you.